Here we are at Changdeokgung, one of the 5 palaces that's in Seoul. So let's go in and explore. Hopefully we'll get some cherry blossoms. Let's go. This is the inside of the main gate in Changdeokgung, and aside from being a delightfully visually interesting structure, it served an actual practical function up until relatively recently, up until basically, I think, the Korean War. The top level of the gate was where they sounded the drums to sound curfew every night. You might not be aware, but in most pre-industrial places, cities had curfews. They literally shut down, and the idea was to prevent crime. And so if you were caught out after curfew, you faced serious consequences. I think in Korea you could actually be caned. This palace is actually one of the earliest ones to be built here in what was then called Hanyang. It was built in 1405 in the reign of Taejong, the first of the Joseon kings. Now, what you see around you now is sadly not what was built in 1405, because this palace has burnt down an awful lot and frequently and again, and they keep rebuilding it. But as far as I can tell, they keep rebuilding it in the same style. So hypothetically, what you see here is mostly in a 15th century style. In fact, this is one of the few palaces to mostly have survived the Japanese occupation of Korea. Unfortunately, when a fire burnt most of its structures down in 1917, they actually then took structures from Changdeokgung Palace and brought them here. And so restoration works have been underway across all of the palaces for years. And someday they actually hope to have them restored to their pre-occupation of Korea state. Let's go see what there is and what has changed in the last 3 years since we were last here. Let's go. As you start visiting more and more palaces in Korea, if you have that privilege as I do, you're going to notice these trenches, these moats, and they are not cosmetic, they're not ornamental. They're actually part of the palace's water defenses. As I said, many palaces in Korea burnt down multiple times, and so having these massive moats of water at their disposal was intended to help prevent them from burning down entirely. So yes, they are beautiful. Well, there's no water in them right now. In the summer, there tends to be water in them. They are beautiful, but they are entirely functional. So also here in this beautiful water ditch is an auspicious creature. That is a tiger, which of course is another symbol of longevity and good luck. Again, intended to bring luck onto the palace and probably to help prevent fires. I suppose one might say that maybe there would have been more fires had they not implemented all of these means. Here we are at the main throne room of Changdeokgung, and you can tell it's quite an impressive structure with its multi-stories. Interestingly, you might notice that on the edge of the roof, you can see all those little figures that are worked into the gables there. There's actually no solid written evidence as to the nature of those figures, but there's a couple of theories. The most current theory is apparently that they are the figures from the famous tale, The Journey to the West, about the Monkey King and Piggy and all that. And apparently, the more auspicious, the more prominent and important a building, the more of those figures the gables will feature. Another theory is that they're there to bring good luck and to ward away evil spirits and prevent the buildings from burning down. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to have worked very well. Another feature here is this approach. You'll notice there's this raised road sort of connecting the gate to the throne hall. The central portion, you will be shocked to learn, is for the king and the king alone. The side roads, the side lanes were intended for his officials. Of course, Korean society, or Joseon society, was extremely hierarchical, thank you, Neo-Confucianism. And you can also see that in the way the courtyard is laid out. So over here on our right is where, during ceremonies and official gatherings, the officials would array themselves by rank And that's what each of those little plaques, those stone plaques are. They should tell which rank goes where. And then on the left were military officers. And again, you can tell they were aligned neatly by rank. So everything very orderly in the Neo-Confucian world of Joseon. So let's go take a look at the inside of the throne hall. Here is the interior of the Great Throne Hall of Changdeokgung. Now, it's very decorative, but as always, decorative and ornamental does not mean empty of meaning. And indeed, the screen behind the throne, that is the symbol of the king, and it's composed of multiple symbols in and of itself. You have the sun and the moon, which represent the yin and the yang, and the king and the queen. You have the 5 sacred mountains of Joseon, one of which is apparently in North Korea, sadly. And that screen would be placed behind the king wherever he was, apparently. This hall also features some Western elements, which are unique because none of the other throne halls have this. And you can see the yellow silk curtains and the massive, massive chandeliers with their matching silk drapery around the bulbs. So again, this space was used up until the 1920s as such. And with this random sea of humanity swarming about, perhaps you can get an idea as to what the king would have seen when he looked out on a courtyard full of people arrayed in their courtly finery, by rank, in a perfectly orderly and Neo-Confucian fashion. Okay, onward to the next. This fantastically blue roof, we're showing you this for a particular reason, and it's because it's the only blue tiled roof in Korea. And there's a reason for that. Those tiles were imported in the 17th century from Arabia. The distance between Joseon and Arabia back then was immense, and of course the cost of having such tiles was equally immense. Therefore, having a building tiled in it sort of was a statement of conspicuous consumption by the king. That is in fact the cabinet building. That is where the king met with his officers and his advisors in private to discuss matters. So it's a smaller space than the throne room, more intimate, more suited to having discussions. Let's go check that out next. This throne room was specifically for the king to meet with his cabinet ministers and discuss affairs of state. Hence, its more intimate sizing and dimensions relative to the throne hall in the main part of the palace, which of course is massive. You can also tell that this was used very late in the Joseon dynasty because there are, again, electrified light fixtures all around the room. Behind me is part of the palace that was in use up until the 1920s, and you can tell that because there is a porte cochere that has been installed. And a porte cochere was originally for coaches, but this one was designed specifically for the king's vehicle, his own car. You can see those cars actually in the Palace Museum over in Chengdukung. But this palace, this part of the palace, was updated, electrified. It has Western appointments on the inside. So let's go take a look.
All this beauty may actually obscure a haunted history. In the 1880s, the Queen's physician wrote that the gateways fashioned in various charming designs to form frames, as it were, for the beautiful vistas beyond, are choked with a wild growth of vines and weeds. Fancy has not to look far or listen long to read in all this deserted and neglected beauty the story of that one night of blood and horror, and to hear in every chilled whisper of shuddering foliage the word haunted. Well, on that particularly cheery note, let's go take a look at this potentially haunted interior space.
Here is the inside of the more modern part of the palace. You can clearly see the Western furniture, the Western style electrified lighting. You know, it's an interesting combination of East meets West because the ceiling is very clearly traditional palace painting style. But then you have the very Western, well, yes, west from here, I suppose, Persian style rug, wall-to-wall carpeting, and European style velvet covered seats, a roll top desk. Even though we're standing here in Changdeokgung, this part of the palace was actually originally erected over in Gyeongbokgung, but this part burned down in 1917. So they actually deconstructed parts of the buildings in Gyeongbokgung, brought them over here, and then resurrected them here. So this part here was apparently the king's reception hall, sort of where he worked. And then the part behind us that we're about to go see was apparently the queen's quarters and also where the king slept. So let's go check that out. All of these little connecting corridors, apparently most of the buildings used to be connected this way. They're not quite sure how many were, because the records have apparently not been well preserved, but the buildings that have survived indicate this sort of interior corridor connection system. In Changdeokgung, this is where the king and the queen lived their daily lives and slept. And you may notice that on the central structure here, there is no central ridge, unlike the ridge on the king's sort of work building that's in front of here. There's no real, apparently solid knowledge on why that is, because no one bothered to write down why they forgot to put a central ridge here. Two theories apparently prevail. One, that central ridge is actually called the Dragon's Ridge, and so in Korean, and the king was the dragon. So one theory is that there can only be one dragon in the queen's quarters, and that is the king. Is that this is where the queen and her women slept, and so the lack of a ridge informs the viewer that this is the female's quarters, even though apparently the king slept on the left and the queen slept on the right, and they had a common living area there in between them. And apparently the last king of Korea inhabited these quarters up until 1926, I believe, when he died. These gorgeous brass basins that are placed around this platform actually served a practical purpose. Apparently they were filled with water and they were intended to fight fires here that may break out in the queen's quarters. Unfortunately, you can imagine this is really not enough water to fight any fires. Unfortunately also, the theory behind it was that just having these basins filled with water would scare away fire demons and thereby prevent fires from happening. But since this palace burned down a lot and frequently, I don't think it actually worked. This auspicious looking door behind me is the entrance to the modern Western style kitchens that were built in the 19-teens apparently. One of the last kings of Choson, or the last king of Choson, really enjoyed waffles and pancakes. I would also like to note on a personal level, I take umbrage to this. This is preventing me from going into this kitchen, which looks like a very serviceable kitchen, as you're probably seeing right now as we overlay interior shots over what I'm saying. Well, since I can't go cook in this kitchen, I suppose we shall go explore some other part. This part of Changdeokgung is where, for at least at one period or another, the ladies of the court lived. The queen mother, the queen, concubines, crown princesses. And unfortunately for them, they weren't really allowed to leave the palace. And there's K-dramas about this where it is a serious plot point and is used actually sometimes as an excuse to dethrone a princess if she goes out and about on her own without special dispensation. What's interesting though, here they have actually opened the doors to the Ondol heating system. Ondol is the Korean floor heating. they were much more sophisticated than American homes are in terms of HVAC, as we will see. So you can actually see, maybe put a picture over top of this, yeah. There is a oven, which is where the fire was stoked, and then beneath that is a gap, a hole where the ashes fell and also where the air vented. And the hot air would then circulate and snake back and forth underneath of the wooden floors in these buildings, thereby creating perfectly even heating. One of the many reasons that Koreans take their shoes off when they go inside. This charming little terraced area is the back garden of the ladies' quarters, and it was specifically built so that they could have basically a nice space where they observe the seasons changing in the vegetation, and so that it was decorative, because as I said, they weren't really allowed to leave the palace, and only for very special occasions. In Korean royal architecture, there is much beauty, but very little beauty that is purely ornamental. So you see these beautiful plaques in the center of this chimney. Those are 2 of the 10 traditional symbols of prosperity and longevity in Korea: the crane and the deer. The chimneys you see in the back of the lodgings are the chimneys for the Ondol heating, and you can tell that one chimney could serve as the vent for multiple furnaces, and the number of furnaces can be easily assessed by the number of little black flue covers on the top of the chimney. So this one was at least 2, but there might be 2 on the other side. It's 4. There's 2 on the other side, so it's 4 total. So that means that 4 separate furnaces fed into this chimney to vent the smoke out from underneath of the houses. This auspicious looking gate at the top of these scintillating stairs is actually an entrance to the secret garden, which is this massive patch of greenery basically behind the palaces. And it's the place to which the royal family would retreat when they wanted to escape the officials, escape their court life, escape their responsibilities, and just retreat to basically what felt like, a forest country home. And as you will notice, do not enter. Yet again, they are preventing the Contessa from enjoying a part of the palace she would very much like to see. Well, I suppose that means we must move onward. Dear viewers, one of my primary admonishments to you in our travels is to always remember to look up. And that is no exception here at Changdeokgung. If you look up, you can see there's this gorgeous gable with this beautiful inlay. And in the center of that inlay is a piece of wooden grating carved in a Chinese character that stands for the symbol for well-being. It is the pictogram for well-being. That, however, is not purely ornamental, as with many things that seem decorative, they are not. That is part of the ventilation system for these gorgeous wooden structures. So you have the ventilation up above in the roof area, the ceiling area, and then below at the floor level, you have more openings that are intended to create a circular airflow, thereby preserving the wood, preventing mold, maybe also even preventing it from becoming too dry, and also helping to climate control the interior of the building. So another innovative approach in Korean palace architecture. Let's go onward. So this conspicuously colorless part of the palace was actually built in 1846 by the 26th king of Joseon. And it has very Chinese characteristics in its decor because he was apparently a fan of Qin culture. And so he had this place built and incorporated those elements into the structure. Interestingly, apparently the last royal family of Joseon actually inhabited these spaces up until 1989, at which point they had been severely modernized. So a restoration effort was undertaken, and so it's now been restored. It's now been restored to its original 1846 state. So there's quite a lot of interesting life, royal life that happened here not that long ago. This is another part of the palace built in 1846, and these apartments were apparently built for the Queen Dowager and the young king's grandmother. Yeah, one definitely gets the impression that the Queen Dowager was the more important figure in this court, considering that the last space we sat in, the much smaller one, was for the concubine. And this much grander space is the part that was built in 1846 for the young king himself. So we had king's quarters. Over there in between was his concubine, the Lady Kim, and on the other side was the Queen Dowager. So this lovely little complex, all built in 1846, and as I said, apparently was inhabited by the royal family until the late 80s, but has thankfully since been restored because I'm pretty confident it didn't look particularly lovely by the late 80s. As I mentioned, the 26th king apparently held a deep fascination for Chinese stylings, and you can see that in that charming little hobbit hole style door at the back of this room with its beautiful circular, elegant circular sweep and the gorgeous screen work over top of the paper.
Well, if you enjoyed that content, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you'd like to benefit from extra value, then do consider becoming one of my patrons on Patreon, where you will receive access to a host of extra benefits, more video content, longer video content, also digital downloads with instructions, recipes, and depending on your level of patronage, private lessons from moi, the Contessa. Okay, enjoy.